join me in welcoming Dr. Tobin.
Do I need to use that thing or can I shout?
It's up to you, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Use it.
Well, you can take it out if you want to.
No, it'll have the virtue that you won't be able to see so much of me, so that's a good thing. Can I bring it forward a little bit? Okie doke. Well, now look, Michael, thank you very much. We're at a very challenging moment in the provision of health care by Catholics and other Christians and other collaborators here in Australia. And what I haven't done is I haven't done the kind of thing that Anthony Fisher is so good at. He gets up here and he rattles off the number of schools that we have and the number of hospitals that we have, public and private, and the number of beds in those hospitals. Paul McClintock will be able to fill in for me later. The number of beds we have in our aged care institutions. But if you go on the website of the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney and go to pretty well any one of Anthony Fisher's marvellous talks and papers there, you'll get all of those figures. But I wouldn't be telling you anything you don't know when I say that the Catholic community in Australia has made an extraordinarily valuable contribution to healthcare in this country. And I'll leave aside education and universities and all of that. Let me just concentrate on healthcare. But it is a challenging time for us. It's just on 130 years since the first 5 Irish Sisters of Charity left Dublin and came out to Australia to provide health care, the first health care available to the sick poor here in Australia. The man who welcomed them when their boat arrived here was John Hubert Plunkett, after whom my centre is named, and he took them out to his home in Parramatta, where he put them up until he found them a place in King's Cross, and then he found them a building from which they could begin their vocation. And then he went to the government of the day. This is about halfway through the 19th century. And he said to the government of the day, you know that strip of land right out there in the outback in that place that they're beginning to call Darlinghurst? You know how you'll never need it? Could we just have it, please, to give to these wonderful sisters? And the government of the day gave it to them. And so then they had a place for a hospital. And then John Hubert Plunkett knew that they'd need a bit of money to be able to build a hospital. So he made some flyers for them and he ran a public campaign. And it was extremely successful. He got, I'm hopeless on figures, but some gigantic amount, like £10,000, enormous amount at that time. And the sisters were able to build their first hospital. And in his advertising, he wanted to let people know about this wonderful new group of people. And it was terrific what he said. And as I say, very successful. Now, what am I doing wrong?
So we can hear you a little bit better.
Okay, all right. How's that? Anyway, it was very successful. This has rather ruined my punchline. The information on the flyers was not about the Irish Sisters of Charity. In fact, he'd confused them in his information with the French Daughters of Charity. We used to call them the old butterfly nuns because of the habit. Anyway, didn't seem to matter. It was very successful. And thus we have the beginning of the wonderful St Vincent's. So I've been privileged to work there for the last over 25 years. I just think it's a wonderful institution. And more recently, and I have the privilege of working with a number of other Catholic hospitals and systems of healthcare, and that's been terrific too. And like any family, I'm one of 8 kids, and we spent most of our childhood fighting with each other. And like any kind of family, the Catholic institutions, have their moments when they're sort of bickering with each other. But in the last 2 years, I've seen the best collaboration between all the Catholic hospitals and aged care facilities and systems that I've ever seen. And what brought us together was the passing of the so-called Voluntary Assisted Dying Act in Victoria. And when that was passed in December 2017, the government set aside 18 months to put in place its arrangements, and that gave us 18 months to put in place our arrangements to respond to it. And as I say, it's a sign of real hope, I think, the way that people have come together and we've worked out how we will provide healthcare in this completely new context. But I'll come to that. Let me go back a little bit and tell you that one of the really interesting things that I've been involved in my role is to work with some others. It's not quite 20 years ago, but nearly, to write the first ever Code of Ethical Standards for Catholic health and aged care facilities in Australia. All the Catholic bioethicists were brought together around the table by Francis Sullivan, who was then CEO of Catholic Health Australia. He commissioned us, he commissioned my centre to kind of do the dog's work associated with it. And it took us a couple of years of talking with everyone and doing drafts and sending them out and revising them and coming back. And that group of Catholic bioethicists, we'd meet round the table about once every 6 months. And again, like a nice big Catholic family, we'd bicker with each other. Our chair was Bishop Michael Putney. And Bishop Michael Putney was a wonderful chair. Whilst he was in the room, we behaved. When he slipped out, we got stuck into each other again. But anyway, we produced a code, and I use it not quite every day, but I use it often. And having had a hand in writing the damn thing, no one is more aware of its shortcomings than I am. But that said, it's been a very good instrument for the Catholic hospitals and aged care facilities. And in the introduction to that code, we explain that in writing it, we wanted to achieve 2 things. We had 2 ambitions. One was to show what is distinctive about the provision of health care in the Catholic Christian community, what's distinctive, where we differ from everybody else. And then our second ambition, you've guessed it, is to show what we have in common with everybody else, with the best of secular thought. And so the code itself is divided into a relatively brief first kind of religious section, which sets out 5 ideas, and then the main part of the code is like pretty well any manual of good healthcare ethics that any hospital or health system might produce. And I thought that I would just mention to you the 5 kind of principles that come from our Catholic tradition, which form the background for the way we understand healthcare. And they are respect for persons within a culture of life. Now that's utterly familiar to us, but when we explain it, we talk about responsible stewardship for one's own life. And that way of thinking about the relationship of a person to his own life is foreign to most of the culture within which we live and work today. For example, people think of the body as property. It's my property. I can do what I like with it. Whereas in our tradition, we think of it as something, as a gift, for which we have to be responsible stewards. So that's the first idea. The second one is healthcare and the mission of the church, and it's pretty simple. It's the idea that Jesus did basically two things. He preached and he healed. And when you think of the significance of his preaching, the revolutionary nature of what he was saying, for him to spend as much of his energies on healing people tells us how central it is to our tradition. The third idea is just the goals of healthcare. And here there's a lot of overlap with what other people think, but again, there's much that's distinctive: to prevent disease, to deepen our understanding of disease, to find new cures and forms of relief, to save life, to cure illness, to slow the progress of disease, to relieve suffering and disability, to care for people, just to care for people when people are old and sick and frail and elderly, and then finally to assist a person in that transition from life. And I want to come back to that language of assisting a person to die and say a few more things about the Victorian legislation. The fourth one is justice in healthcare, just stewardship of healthcare resources. The fifth one is collaboration in health and aged care with people who both need healthcare ourselves and with the practitioners who provide it. So the sick person, well, let's start from the well person. The well person, that's us, is the person with the primary responsibility for making decisions about his or her own healthcare. And our tradition has always respected that, always treated the person in the bed as the person as with the primary responsibility for decision making. Of course, when people are sick, they're not so good at decision making, and so that's where we need to be providing help and support. And then the other person in that relationship is the healthcare provider, the doctor or the nurse. So they're our collaborators. And then just two more, something called respect for personal embodiment. Respect for personal embodiment. Now that one really matters today, and I'd like to come back to it to say something about the contemporary ideology of transgenderism, which makes my gender all up there in my head. And then the last one, solidarity and the mystery of suffering. I had a wonderful colleague at St V's a long time ago. She's long left. And she was just a terrific colleague. She wasn't a Catholic, she wasn't a Christian of any kind. And she said, my problem with... Oh dear. Okay, all right. Now I don't... Is it on? Oh, okay, I'll eat it. She said, you Christians think suffering's a good thing. You Catholics think suffering's a good thing. Well, it was such a pleasure to take her to the Code of Ethics. And I remember it was Anthony Fisher who wrote the line which said, suffering is never a good thing. And then, of course, he went on to talk about what can be made of suffering. So they're the kind of religious principles that frame that whole big Code of Ethics. What I'd now like to do is just to say a little bit about, by way of both challenges and opportunities, about terminations, doctor-assisted suicide, respect for personal embodiment, cosmetic surgery, gender reassignment surgery, and then something about justice in the allocation of healthcare resources. Now, all I want to say about the terminations thing is just to draw your attention to that awful bit in the Victorian legislation which says of any doctor who has a conscientious objection to providing a deliberate termination, that he or she has an obligation to refer the person to someone the doctor knows will provide it. And it's a terrible, illegitimate encroachment on respect for conscientious objection. But that said, just before I leave terminations, one of the things I find with people who come and do a little course at St Vincent's in our Code of Ethics, and we've got fantastic new people coming to the hospital all the time, bringing great knowledge and expertise and wisdom, but often from with outside even a Christian context. And they often think that in a circumstance, that very rare circumstance in which a pregnant woman's life is at risk, they often think that Catholics just say that you've got to stand back and tie your hands behind your back and do nothing and let everybody, mother and baby, die. So it's always very important to explain the difference, but to explain that we don't think that, we believe that one should never deliberately end a life, either at the beginning or at the end. But there are circumstances, both at the beginning and at the end, where good health care will mean that we know in advance that someone will die. It might be the little tiny bub who's removed from the mother's uterus in order to save her life, but at an age where we know in advance the baby is either unlikely to survive or certainly won't survive. And the critical thing is to make sure people understand the difference between that very rare circumstance and deliberate terminations. But let me go on to the doctor-assisted suicide one in Victoria. Now, one of the problems we face is that no one will call it what it is. The law has legalised in quite specific circumstances. They're very proud of the fact they've got 68 safeguards. You'd think they'd wonder about what they're doing if they need to have 68 safeguards. So now the law has said that if certain conditions are met, a doctor can assist a person to commit suicide. And if the person meets all the eligibility criteria but is unable to take the substance, which they call a medication, and drink it, it's a poison, in that quantity, then the doctor is permitted to do it himself or herself. Now, one of our difficulties is that they call it voluntary assisted dying. And what I have tried to say, against a bit of resistance both from within my own circle of colleagues in Catholic healthcare and certainly from outside, is to remind people that when our patients are dying, we assist them to die in comfort and with dignity. That's precisely what we're doing when we provide palliative medicine and care. That's what we're doing. But we won't ever assist them to take their own lives. And we won't ever kill them ourselves. So to me, it's a great source of dismay that around the world where these things are being legalised, they won't call them for what they are. And even some of our own people want to refer to what's now legal, which we won't be offering in our services, as voluntary assisted dying. I think it's a great mistake. The Western Australians have just had a parliamentary inquiry, and that inquiry has just come down with its report. I sent a very short submission in saying, please be frank and forthright in your language. I had a quick look today to see if, well, no, I didn't get anywhere at all. They're going to call it voluntary assisted dying there. So it's a very great pity, because it's the co-opting of language which accurately describes what we have been doing for 130 years to describe something quite different. That said, there's one good thing about the Victorian legislation, and that is that whereas with the abortion legislation some years ago, they said if you, the doctor, won't do it, you've got to refer someone. That isn't present in the Victorian legislation. There's no such obligation. And indeed, during the debates in the Parliament, again and again, the parliamentarians who were promoting the bill said, of course we will recognise that some hospitals and some systems will not provide this service for ethical reasons. And of course we won't force them. Of course there'll be no coercion. And I have to say that in the 18 months that the Victorian Department of Health has been preparing, they have acknowledged that some hospitals and some systems won't provide this new VAD, some because they don't have resources, some because they don't have this or that or the other, and they acknowledge that some won't provide it because they have ethical objections. So it doesn't fit with their values, is the language that they use. So we should be grateful for that, and we should hold them to account for that. We should make sure there's no slippage from that position. The thing that we had to work on amongst ourselves, the Catholic hospitals and systems, was something that the Canadians have done, which is to say that in exceptional circumstances, if someone's in the Catholic hospital and that person wants to have their eligibility for this voluntary assisted dying, it's called MAID in Canada. If someone wants their eligibility assessed, the Catholic hospitals in Canada, some of them have said they'll allow the assessment to take place in the Catholic hospital. We thought about that carefully and we said, no, we won't do that. The assessment is only for the purpose of telling whether the person is eligible for assistance in suicide. So we will be very courteous, very respectful, very humane. We will make arrangements so that the person can leave the hospital, can be transferred to a facility where that kind of assessment is available. What we are doing from the beginning is making it clear that this is not something we want anything to do with. Now, of course, some people say, well, your private hospitals, that's okay. You can do what you like. But in your public hospitals, we're not so sure about that. Maybe you've got to toe our line. Now, I think this will be a matter of political will, not just on the part of the politicians, but on the part of the leaders of the Catholic hospitals and systems. And as I say, Catholic Health Australia has brought us all together with the best collaboration and cooperation I've seen in all my time. So that's a bit of a mixed story. It's dismaying, but there are some things that are pleasing. I wanted to say a little bit about cosmetic surgery. In our code of ethics, here's a real problem for us. In our private hospitals, cosmetic surgery can be a very important part of our business operation. And our private hospitals they're not for profit, but they've got to make ends meet, and they've got to generate resources that we can use for other purposes, for the poor and the sick. So there is a real problem there. But in our code of ethics, what we say is that Catholic healthcare facilities should resist cooperation in the excessive cultural emphasis on physical appearance. Those suffering from various psychological or spiritual disorders associated with poor body image should be assisted to resist the misuse of drugs, surgical and genetical procedures in the pursuit of some idealised perfect body. So that's all we say, but you can see the direction of it, can't you? And when you hear of what young people, what forms of cosmetic surgery they are accessing when they're only in their teens, it's troubling. What about gender reassignment surgery? Now, our code, drawing on that respect for personal embodiment, makes the point, well, first of all, there's a problem about the words sex and gender. I take sex to refer to that the biological fact of, on the whole and by and large, everybody is a man or a woman. Before we go on to gender, we should remember that a very small number of people suffer from debilitating conditions of what's called intersex, with, I'm struggling over the word I'm after, but anyway, with confused biology, be it genitalia or genetics or hormonal conditions, where it isn't clear whether this is a man or a woman. But that's a very rare condition, and it's no doubt a source of terrible suffering for parents and for the young person growing up, and requires really prudent, humane, compassionate response. But what we're dealing with today is something completely different. There's a whole philosophical history of ideas which has led up to it, and you'll be very glad that I'm not going to even try to say anything about that. But one of the guys we need to blame is René Descartes, who made a big distinction between the body and the mind, or the body and the psyche, or the body and the soul. And one way or another, we're in a position now where people can say seriously that my gender is a matter for my decision. My gender's in my head. If I think I'm a man, I'm a man. If I think I'm a woman, I'm a woman. Now this is a completely new thing. There have always been those very rare conditions, and I probably haven't said enough about them, but this is new. And it's a very big difficulty for, I think, any paediatric endocrinologist, not just those who are working in Catholic hospitals. And some of the best endocrinologists are the people working at the 2 Children's Hospital here, who slowly and carefully and humanely and prudently slow things down. I think the very great challenge must be for teachers in our schools, how to handle that, because it's a kind of ideology that's washing through our culture at the moment. Maybe it'll wash out again, but we're at a bad moment there. But just every now and again, someone comes to one of our hospitals wanting gender reassignment surgery. So that's something that we have to humanely, respectfully, carefully explain why we don't offer it. And with that, Isabella is giving me the wind-up sign, you'll be pleased to know. So I'll leave it at that, except to say this, that with both taxpayer-funded healthcare and private healthcare, but in particular taxpayer-funded healthcare, the public healthcare system, there are big decisions to be made about the allocation of healthcare resources. What disease category, what person to put ahead of what other person. And you'll have heard of those so-called dilemmas where there's only one bed in intensive care and there are 2 people who you'd like to accommodate there. So decisions sometimes need to be made between individual persons, and decisions need to be made about whole disease categories. And one of the great things in our tradition is that it contains the resources for helping people make good decisions there. And the resources are different from some of the resources that come from secular society, which emphasise efficiency and efficacy. And efficiency and efficacy matter, but they aren't the only things that matter. And the greatest mind on this, perhaps in the world, is our very own Archbishop, whose DPhil thesis at the University of Oxford was, he called it an Aristotelian account of justice in the allocation of healthcare resources, but I think he might have called it that for strategic reasons. It's very much Aristotle and Aquinas and those great thinkers in our tradition. So no one has made a better contribution to our thinking there than our very own Anthony Fisher.